Loud. Welcome, everyone. I am Alicia Swami, and I have my co-host Eric Johnson here, and we are exposing mold. We're missing Keely. She is tending to some family needs, so we are missing her here, but always in presence here. I'll cut that out. I don't know. I'm just jabbering now. Today we have Dr. Kurt Woeller. He is a integrative and functional medicine physician, author, lecturer, and clinical practitioner offering specialized diagnostic testing and health interventions for individuals with complex medical conditions such as autism, autoimmune conditions, GI, and neurological disorders. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it. And as I said before, we are highly interested in a webinar that you conducted with Great Plains Laboratory, and you discussed T2 trichothecene mycotoxins. And that's something that we wanted to focus in on today because you really got into the chemistry of it, and we enjoyed that because it's not often talked about. And so maybe just to give insight to our audience members, maybe you can just give us a little rundown of that webinar and just make it a little bit more digestible for them.
Yeah, so that webinar was, I've done a number of webinars for Great Plains, actually for many years. And I also do a lot of teaching through my own online academy called Integrative Medicine Academy, where we talk about mold, mycotoxins, certainly talk about many other things. But my focus on this particular webinar was I had actually previous to this done a webinar on just the general topic of mycotoxins and the negative influence they can have on mitochondrial function. Because we know now in medicine, it's been known for a long time in integrative functional medicine, but it's becoming more well known in even conventional medicine that mitochondria and problems in mitochondria play a role in a huge amount of diseases. And so I thought I would focus a bit on these trichothecenes. That's how I pronounce it. Some of these things are difficult to pronounce. But it was interesting in the angle that I tried to take and just looking at some of the chemical aspects of it and why they're toxic. One of the things that I'm interested in personally is trying to understand more about the chemistry of these things and why they're uniquely toxic. So every chemical has its unique characteristics, chemically, obviously, and from a toxicity standpoint, if it is a toxin. But I want to know a little bit more about the why things happen. And so that was the main focus here, is just to look at some of the chemical structure of trichothecenes, what makes it uniquely toxic, why it reacts the certain way at the cellular level, what kind of damage it can cause. And so that was the initiating part. And then we get part of it. And then we got into, certain examples of that, and the fact that it can interfere with immune function, and it can interfere with liver function and cause dysregulation at the cellular level that can affect things on a DNA level. And what does that mean clinically? Because ultimately, people who are being exposed to these mycotoxins can develop all different types of health disorders, from cancers to autoimmune problems to immune system issues to gut problems. And so that was the main thrust. And really where we ended with this particular talk is going back to the mitochondria. What happens at the mitochondrial level with this group of mycotoxins, and what do? Why does the mitochondria become damaged in the presence of these things? And so that webinar was really meant to ask some questions and try to answer some of those questions.
Awesome. Thank you for that. There was something that I was interested in, and, you did cover a lot of the chemistry aspect of it. And I'm assuming you've been practicing medicine for a while. I'm assuming you are noticing different things with mold injured patients. Is there an aspect that you're noticing with molds and just mycotoxicity and mold related illnesses that just don't seem to match the literature that currently is out there?
Yeah, I mean, there is to some degree. Well, let me put it to you this way. It certainly isn't well known in the conventional medical world. It's better known in the integrative medicine world, but I think more from a surface level standpoint. And that's not to say that people can't understand it, but when you start talking about the chemistry of it, now you're talking about the inorganic chemistry, the organic chemistry aspects, and the influence that has on the biochemistry. And it's an extremely difficult topic. In fact, in undergraduate, college, and even graduate college, organic chemistry is one of the most complicated types of sciences you can take. It's extremely difficult to understand. And the reality is, in a clinical practice, you don't really need to know it. It's not really going to necessarily change perhaps what you do fundamentally in trying to help a patient, et cetera. But from an educational standpoint, and I really believe, and this is something that I've taken on myself, for us as integrative and functional medicine practitioners, I really feel we need to have a strong understanding of the fundamental basic sciences and learn more about how it applies or potentially applies clinically in practice. Because the more we can understand about the mechanisms, the more we can try and understand other relationships that may show up with other chemicals, looking at nutrients, looking at supplements, looking at medications, and understanding more about the modes of action and activity. And so that's, I think, where a lot of people tend to fall short. Again, not that people aren't able to understand the information. They either have never been exposed to it, or they're so busy in practice, it's just difficult to understand or spend the time learning these types of things. So most of my experience in the conventional medical world is they know very little with regards to mycotoxins. They'll know a lot about mold and allergy or mold infections. But when it comes to mycotoxins, I mean, there are doctors I've come in contact who don't even really know what they are. In the integrative world, that's different. People are much more open to it, much more aware to it. And that's a good thing. Now it gets down to trying to understand the unique cellular and molecular reactions that these mycotoxins are having. And so a lot of the information, as you know, comes out of the veterinary world and the world of agricultural medicine, where they've studied these things quite a bit. And so this is now becoming more well known to us. And it's important, and I think we'll just continue to learn more as time goes on. But does it match the literature? No, honestly, it doesn't in many regards, because things are just so misunderstood. I still come in contact with practitioners that don't quite grasp what is the difference between a mycotoxin of the mold and the mold itself. And trying to just get people to understand that concept is critically important. And even the general public, I think, sometimes gets confused about, well, what is the difference? And the difference is the mold is the organism that produces the mycotoxin. It is a toxin of the mold, but they're different, right? They fall in different categories. And so you can get rid of a mold infection, but still be toxic from the mycotoxin that the previous mold produced. And then I'm sure you've talked about this on your podcast and shared this with others. That is the critical aspect of people who are suffering chronic illness secondary to mycotoxins. They may no longer be in the presence of active mold, but they're still dealing with the toxic effects of the mycotoxin.
Yeah, why is it so hard to get over trichothecene poisoning?
Well, it's so pervasive, and the damage that it can cause is within the body is so profound. I mean, one of the things I learned in putting this lecture together was all of the different systems that it seems to be able to hit. Now, maybe it has to do with some of the chemical nature. I mentioned in this particular lecture this epoxide group, I think it's the carbon 13 to 14 epoxy ring structure. It's a triangular ring structure bonded to an oxygen. And epoxides by nature, chemically, from my understanding, are very unstable. There's a lot of chemical strain or molecular strain within that configuration. And so it makes it so extremely reactive. And one of the things that's happening because of that chemical reactivity is it reacts with oxygen or reacts with sulfur, for example. So if it's going to react with a thiol group, Well, that's a big problem because we have sulfur and sulfur-containing amino acids all throughout our body, particularly in the brain and nervous system. So we can start to see things from a cellular level of just the interaction with sulfur and how that could compromise the brain, the skin, the digestive system, the liver, the kidneys. So you can almost start to see how it can just be so pervasive throughout our body, almost into any organ system that you can think of.
So do these things get into the fats and stay there and cause damage for a long period of time?
Well, from my understanding, what I've seen with patients is that these mycotoxins can stay in people's bodies for months, if not years. And so they can get into the fat or they get into the cells. And, some of them probably stay there. I'm sure there are attempts from a cellular standpoint to try to conjugate them and break them apart. But one of the things that we see from a testing standpoint is that sometimes people are continuing to spill these things, even though they're no longer actively being exposed. Now, one of the things with regards to mycotoxins in the context of this discussion, when you do mycotoxin testing, you don't often see these trichothecenes because, one of the main molds that's producing it is the Stachybotrys. There's a lot of different types of trichothecenes, but the Stachybotrys molds, are not as common as, let's say, Aspergillus or Penicillium mold. So I think just by numbers, people who have mold exposure in their homes, the vast majority tend to have the Aspergillus Penicillium type of problems. And so to actually have Stachybotrys growing, takes a tremendous amount of water or constant source of humidity for that thing to really proliferate. I just actually had a consult in the past month or so with an individual that had massive Stachybotrys exposure, her whole family. And so they're significantly compromised. But, in my consulting with people, around the country, around the world, the heavy load or the heavy exposure to Stachybotrys isn't as common as it is to things like the Aspergillus and Penicillium. So the main mycotoxin that we often see is ochratoxin. That would probably be the most common mycotoxin that any of us are exposed to just through Aspergillus exposure. So they can stay in the body. I've seen patients who were in a moldy home and 3 years later, they still have elevated mycotoxins because nothing was really done to try to get rid of them. And so the body somehow is, either sequestering them or they're binding up into certain tissues and just kind of staying there.
So what drew your attention to this particular toxin?
Well, I have done a lot of lecturing on chemical exposure. I do something called the organic acids test quite a bit in my practice. And I actually teach an entire seminar on the organic acid test from Great Plains Lab. And on that test, there are markers that are indicative of certain organic acid imbalances that occur because of gut colonization of mold, particularly Aspergillus and Fusarium mold. And so those are two fairly common things for people to get exposed to, and in those cases can actually colonize the gut. There isn't any marker on the organic acid test that is picking up on, let's say, Stachybotrys. However, when you do a mycotox profile on many people who are either representing or showing elevated organic acids linked to mold exposure or not, you'll see many times mycotoxins show up in a very profound way. And I actually had a case, probably going back a couple of years now. I actually do some consulting with for healthcare practitioners, and there was a case that was presented to me of an individual that had, for the most part, a normal-looking organic acid test linked to fungal, candida, and bacterial markers. And the mistake that can be made is that you have practitioners who are looking at that test to dictate whether or not to do a follow-up mycotox profile. And I always tell people, I said, you can't rely on the organic acid test to rule out the existence of mycotoxins. They're an entirely different entity. And so in this particular individual, they had done a mycotox profile as well. And this individual had ochratoxin, gliotoxin, mycophenolic, as well as the reordan E, as well as the verrucorin A coming from Stachybotrys exposure. And the learning lesson in that was you had an individual that had severe mycotoxin exposure getting exposed to Stachybotrys. There was no other test representing any sort of evidence of Stachybotrys exposure. And we know how toxic that is. I mean, you can talk to many, mold home inspectors and they'll tell you how toxic and problematic Stachybotrys is. If they had not done that test and just let it alone, no one ever would have known. And this individual patient was having serious decompensating health issues. And so that really struck me as a, wow, you can have these mycotoxins hidden in the body and really not have another test that can even suggest that it exists. The only way you know is to actually test for it. And that, from that point forward, I really emphasized to practitioners, please do mycotoxin testing. Don't forget it, don't skip over it and just make an assumption that it's not a problem. Because every once in a while you'll find somebody with this, these trichothecenes. In fact, I had another situation of a family that was being mold exposed from a water leak behind their dishwasher. And it turned out it was Stachybotrys.
Wow. Well, I remember you, remediators would often talk about molds being so many millions of spore forming units and so much measurements of this or that or the other thing. And then they talk about Stachybotrys and it's like one mold spore, run for your life. So what is it about this one mold that makes it stand out so that it's not measurable and it seems to be so deadly that they attach a special importance to it?
Yeah, I think it has to do with the mycotoxins that it produces. It's the unique quality of these trichothecenes. And I think, just from a chemical standpoint, when you actually go, there's been some good articles, written on this. And I'm not a toxicologist, so I don't have that kind of training. And, some of the chemistry, I'm having to reach back and go back to some of those earlier textbooks and teachings into that. But many of the articles I've read on mycotoxin toxicity, there's a big emphasis always placed on the macrocyclic nature of the trichothecenes, this epoxy ring structure that has very unique characteristics. For example, that epoxy ring structure is found on certain chemicals. And in fact, I can't remember right now, there's a particular pesticide, I think it is, that we can get exposed to, that as our liver attempts to detoxify it, it increases or enhances the chemical's toxicity. So I made a connection in the lecture that showed that the processing of this chemical through normal liver detoxification enhances the toxicity of the darn thing. And what it's doing is it's disrupting the guanosine, cytosine nucleotide linkage, that base pair linkage within the DNA. And so if you just look at the chemistry of that reaction and then transfer it over to the trichothecenes, again, with this epoxy ring, well, we can see how it too could end up causing damage at the DNA level. And think about it, if we're disrupting base pair reactivity or connections at the nuclear level, right, that can then get transferred into messenger RNA, which can then get sequenced into just sort of abnormal protein production. And then we can really start to branch from there and realize we could be developing all different kinds of deranged proteins that they themselves lead to cellular toxicity in the cell. As far as, the unique aspect of Stachybotrys, maybe, and I'm not quite sure, maybe it has more to do with the toxicity of the mycotoxin that it's producing, that they're so extremely toxic compared to others. of why you don't need a lot of Stachybotrys around in order for it to really cause problems. I had a situation, by the way, sort of in the same theme of that question, was I've seen mold reports come back from patients where it says, hey, look, your aspergillus markers are, they're pretty normal compared to the outside and the inside of your house and what we know is quote unquote normal. And I question that sometimes in patients who are acutely ill, because it might be normal from just an exposure standpoint, but an individual could have an abnormal reaction to even normal, in quote, exposure. And I had a case actually of a family in outside the US, and they have an autistic child who's extremely sensitive to mold exposure. And they actually found aspergillus, no Stachybotrys in this example, but they found aspergillus in the mold. And according to the mold inspecting company's report, it was, in quote, within normal range. When you did the mycotoxin profile on this kid, it had some of the highest mycotoxins that I had seen at the time. One of them was gliotoxin, which was the highest that one of the biochemists at the lab had ever seen. And when we looked at his organic acid test, every single marker indicating aspergillus colonization of the digestive system was elevated. So even though the level in the home was, normal, his body accumulation of it and his mycotoxins that were linked to the aspergillus exposure were anything but normal. And that was one of those other moments where you realize clinically that, individual sensitivity and susceptibility to these things also has to be taken into account. Because again, as you two know, every single person can react in a different way.
Well, when you talk about the structure, the epoxide ring structure, which I guess is an ion dipole, I was wondering if substitution reaction, or like a halogenated alkane reaction, might add something additional to the structure to make it more toxic.
That I don't know. Maybe that your understanding of some of the inorganic chemistry is greater than mine when it comes to that. I haven't looked into that, in any further details. I think that's certainly an interesting, aspect. My understanding, just with regards to that epoxide structure or the epoxy ring, is that it gets attacked, from, or it can get attacked essentially from different substances. But its ability to interact with thiol groups is probably one of the reasons it becomes so problematic in the body, is because it just causes sulfur dysregulation, or it uses up glutathione. Probably the simplest way to think about, taking out thiols is the zapping of glutathione. And once you get rid of your glutathione, well, now all of a sudden you're in a big problem, because mitochondrial activity, just normal mitochondrial activity, is generating oxygen radicals, which can inhibit different sequences in the Krebs cycle, inhibit different things within the electron transport chain, or electron complexes, and just increase, toxicity at the mitochondrial level. One of the things with regards to trichothecenes is not just unique to it. Some of the other mycotoxins damage the mitochondria in various ways, where there's an expression of cytochrome C, which is a chemical that's transferring electrons from complex C to complex 4, complex 3 to complex 4. And when you get a release of cytochrome C, it triggers an apoptosis reaction within the cell. So basically a programmed cell death mechanism where the cell commits suicide. So as far as what else it might exchange with from a halide standpoint, I'm not sure. Matt, it sounds like maybe you've looked at that too.
A little bit, yeah. And it's funny, Dr. Shoemaker goes crazy when people say apoptosis. He says it's apoptosis.
Okay, well, it's
So-
it's it's funny, right? It's, duodenum or duodenum, take your
Yeah,
pick.
it works.
Yeah,
But
it works. Some of these names are extremely, I still have a hard time pronouncing some of the names of these chemicals. But the point is, we're getting the point across. There could be multiple ways of pronouncing a specific word.
well, I continue to say it, and one of the hallmarks of chronic fatigue syndrome was high apoptosis. Bajnani measured that years ago. Now, are you familiar with chronic fatigue syndrome?
I am. I mean, that goes way back in my early part of my career is trying to help people with chronic fatigue. And I remember, it's interesting you bring it up, because I still remember going to a support group. I was practicing in San Diego at the time, and we're probably going back 20 years or more now. And they were taught, there was a major push in this group of everybody needs to take NADH as a supplement. And at that time, I'm like, I'd heard of it. I wasn't quite familiar, with what NADH was, or some of the unique biochemistry of it. But, now knowing now, right, and how, NAD to NADH and Krebs cycle and glycolysis and all of that, it certainly, makes sense to some degree. So you're probably dealing with people who are just dealing with longstanding mitochondrial dysregulation.
Well, that was definitely measured. Well, let me explain a little bit about who I am. I'm the first prototype for Holmes' 1988 chronic fatigue syndrome.
Hmm.
And the way I got into this mess is I got sick at my high school, Truckee High School, and there was a particular section of the school that made everybody sick. It was right up at the front. And nobody could figure it out. They looked at all kinds of chemicals, carpet fumes, the copy machines, anything they could think of, but nothing really seemed to match. And I somehow got the idea that it was mold. So I was telling all the people trying to solve this mystery about it. And an incredible flu came through Lake Tahoe, knocked down actually thousands of people. It was a really bad flu, but people in certain buildings did not recover. And a couple of doctors in Incline Village called the Center for Disease Control for help. This was Dr. Paul Cheney and Dr. Daniel Peterson. And these two CDC epidemiologists come out and they look at the sick buildings and they couldn't make heads or tails of it. And we tried to get them interested in mold, asked them specifically to look into it. And they said, mold is just an allergy. So they declined to do so. And Dr. Gary Holmes eventually wound up writing up a definition based on us to try to solve this mystery. Dr. Cheney called me into his office and asked me if I would volunteer to serve as the first prototype for what he called a new syndrome. And I thought, well, I don't really want to get involved in that. That's a little too crazy for me. He said, well, as a prototype for this syndrome, they'll listen to you. Researchers will talk to you. I go, really? Cool. Then I can take them to the sick buildings and we can talk about the mold. So I went ahead with it and we started this new syndrome. And initially I was a little concerned about serving as a prototype because by staying out of the sick buildings, avoiding the mold, I was already recovering to the point where I didn't really serve as a good representative for just how bad the syndrome can be.
Right.
But I thought as long as I just tell what happened, explain the role of the mold in the sick buildings, then it's okay. I'm still performing my duty here. I'm not interfering with the investigation. So a couple of years go by and the buildings continued to make people sick. The authorities tried their best to clean it up with limited success. They finally called in some of the newly emerging professionals who were dealing with mold toxicity, tested the place and found, lo and behold, Stachybotrys.
Oh my gosh.
And this is the 1994 Saratoga Springs Proceedings Manual. This is sort of the Bible for the indoor air quality profession. This was put out by Eckhard Johanning and Dr. Chin Yang. And this was the first international symposium in 1994. And there's a whole chapter in this book dedicated to asking the question if Stachybotrys in particular is connected with chronic fatigue syndrome. So that was my goal. I thought, well, armed with this book and the fact that I started the syndrome, I should be able to contact researchers and tell them, yes, there actually was Stachybotrys documented in the clusters that baffled the CDC into creating the syndrome. So that's kind of what we've been doing at Exposing Mold, is contacting researchers and telling them the story so that the people who are confused about chronic fatigue syndrome can start to factor the mold into the equation.
Right.
And in particular, figure out why Stachybotrys was such a butt kicker.
So I remember, and that was what year was that?
1985.
Trying to think, I went into practice 96, 97. I was practicing in San Diego, had just come out of my internship, was in an integrative practice at the time. That's where my first introduction to the autism world came in. I started going to conferences in San Diego. Didn't understand or didn't really make the connection with mold in some of those kids then. Did understand Candida, which we know is a fungus. And then my first, I don't remember what year it was, but my first real introduction to a really mold toxic chronic fatigue individual was actually a woman who was an attorney, came to see me, who was renting in a condominium in San Diego at that time. And I want to say it was around, 2000, early 2000. Anyway, she was extremely sick. One of the things that I picked up on was she was very reactive to foods, to the environment, to smells, to perfumes, to laundry detergent, all of it. She was devastated. And at that time, I actually ran a mold test. Now, we didn't have mycotoxin testing at the time, at least that I knew of, but there was a lab in California that was doing antibody testing, not just IgG, but IgA and IgM antibodies. We ran that test and it, lit up like a Christmas tree. I don't remember the specifics now of which molds, but there was a lawsuit brought. So I got called into a deposition, grilled for about 3 hours on the validity of this test. And, because they were fighting it back then. In fact, from what I remember in California, maybe you might remember too, being from Truckee, some of the regulatory agencies at that time were not too happy with labs that were looking at mold. So it's kind of controversial. It's not that way anymore. So it's interesting the timing of that, but from the standpoint of you being in a school, I have now seen over the years that many schools are moldy. In fact, you probably make the argument that most are. In fact, I had a situation with my son going into 4th grade. We show up and I noticed the teacher she looked like to be about her mid-30s. She had a trimmer and she was, I could tell she was cognitively impaired. It wasn't that she wasn't smart, something was clouding her ability to communicate. And I thought, well, this might be a problem. So we came back a couple of weeks later for a sit-in in the classroom. My son was again at 4th grade, and I started to smell mildew. To make a long story short, it turns out the school knew there had been a water main break between the two buildings. The teacher from the 3rd grade classroom was recognizing a smell of mold. And eventually we got my son out of there. The teacher, who was his teacher at the time, came up and said, that room is making me sick. It's continued to make me ill. They brought a company out. They found mold. I don't remember exactly what it was. And then they eventually closed that section of the school down. And I've heard this story, and maybe just being in this world, has been repeated in so many places around the country, again in schools. So it was actually proposed at one point to me from a integrative neurologist I work with, probably one of the largest clienteles of people that they see in their practice with mold toxicity, which would include chronic fatigue, are teachers. So,
Definitely. In fact, one of the schools that was used as a base study cluster for chronic fatigue syndrome was eventually bulldozed completely out of existence.
wow.
Of course, they tell people they just wanted a new school when it wasn't that old to begin with,
Right.
but that was the excuse they use. So over the years, the evidence, the original core evidence that could explain the mystery is disappearing into the past, being bulldozed away or remediated. The school I went to, I don't mean to badmouth my old school, Truckee, they did everything they could to fix it up, and it took them years, and they finally did. I go there now, and it feels great. So, you know, it's not like there's an evil plot to make people sick.
Sure.
This is
Yeah.
just a very difficult thing to deal with.
It is. I actually work with people in other countries and just doing some health education consulting. And I've seen some very difficult situations with a group that I consult with, a doctor group in Pakistan. And I've had a number, and these are mostly autistic kids. It's the vast majority of them have mycotoxins. And what I learned is that the homes in that area, their water heaters are on their roof. And so all of the pipes are filling down through their walls. I've done some consulting with some families in India, and some of the mycotoxins I see on their test are just, I had a gliotoxin over 200,000, you know, so that's unbelievably high. So it's this is a problem all over the world, I'm convinced.
Yeah, do you remember Dr. Jack Dwayne Thrasher?
The name's familiar.
Is a very well-known immunotoxicologist who got involved with toxic mold years ago. But I was in a group with him studying autism. The connection between autism and mold. And at the time, he was not actually a mold believer. He was in the group to talk about chemicals. So we dealt with a case of a lady with an autistic son who avoided a certain portion of the house. And Dr. Thrasher was convinced that it was probably formaldehyde. And I suggested toxic mold. And he argued in favor of his chemical, and I argued in favor of my mold. And we had the gal contact Dr. Gary Ordog, who had the house tested, found Stachybotrys. And since it was found in that particular corner, that settled the matter and made an instant believer out of Dr. Thrasher. But the curious thing is Dr. Thrasher was the advisor for the Chemical Injury Information Network. This was in 1999. And he was totally sold on chemicals at the time, no mention of mold. So it's just like the Center for Disease Control, just like the NIH, like all the researchers, even the patient groups and the advocacy organizations and the chemical injury advocacy groups were completely unaware of toxic mold. So my question is, how is it possible that everybody was so ignorant of toxic mold prior to the 1990s?
Well, I think they're still that way. I mean, I think what I've seen within a patient population is when you tell somebody they likely have heavy metal toxicity or exposure, it's like, oh, that makes sense. When you tell somebody, you know what, you've got likely chemical exposure, organophosphates, you know, whatever. Oh, I can see that. Okay, people don't seem to have a problem. When you mention mold, I can't tell you, this isn't just me. I communicate with many other practitioners, but when you mention mold, not everybody, of course, but a lot of people go, oh, that can't be, you know, no, my home is mold free. No, it was checked out, it's totally fine. it's almost like they argue against it. And I don't know if it's because everything that's wrapped around mold is so encompassing, because it really gets to the heart of mold in your home means you have to have remediation, means you might have to move out, means, you know, it costs money. It may mean that it doesn't have good resale value. I don't know. All of those dynamics come in. Whereas like a chemical exposure or something else seems a little bit more reasonable. I mean, why these things happen, I don't have an answer for it. It's a trend that I've seen. I mean, I still find it hard to believe that the vast majority of the medical profession can't even have a basic understanding of adverse vaccine reactions seen in autism.
Absolutely. And you know, just to throw in a tangent here, I'm just curious, like, are you finding mold toxicity playing a role in many disease states? It seems like I hear this all the time amongst many chronically ill patients that have XYZ diagnoses. And then, you know, they say, oh, and I had a leaky basement, or, you know, I also have mold. It's like, how big of a role or how little of a role is mold playing in all of these type of diseases?
It's playing a big role. What makes it challenging is it's not always easy to remedy. And that's what's a challenge. And the other thing that is a challenge is that a lab test tells you the existence of a toxin. It doesn't tell you, well, let's say a mycotox profile. It tells you the toxin exists. It doesn't tell you how toxic your patient is to that toxin. And so I've often made the comment that the presence of a toxin is toxic, but it doesn't automatically mean that you're toxic from the toxin. But the longer that toxin stays around, the greater chance it has to become toxic to you. And so it's a challenge because there's a lot of things that are done where, you know, there's an element of medicine that is the practice of medicine, right? It's not always 100% definitive. And so you move forward with interventions based on the best knowledge that you have clinically, the clinical presentation of the individual, physical exam, lab testing, and what seems to make the most sense. And when you start comparing, and I think maybe this goes back to your earlier question about the unique quality of Stachybotrys, or is it just the unique chemical characteristics of the Trichothecenes? When you start comparing the toxicity levels, when you look at the toxicity index or whatever, you know, the terms are used, mycotoxins from a biological standpoint are some of the most toxic substances around. And so just by their existence for people with chronic health, it seems to make sense to go after those things as a heavy priority, because they may be able to deal with certain chemicals or metals or whatever else, but it's the mycotoxin that just is just so damaging and overwhelming of their biochemistry. The other thing that makes this a challenge, and I know you've thought, you know, run into this yourself, is you have the mycotoxin, then you have the mold, right? You got the other volatile organic, you know, compounds that get produced, but the mold itself is generating immune reactivity. So now you're getting immune activation, both within the innate immune system and then crossing over to the adaptive immune system, and people are locked in a chronic state of inflammation. And then that chronic state of inflammation, whether it's the gut, the liver, the kidneys, the brain, that has its own catastrophic effects. Then you pile on the mycotoxins, which now dysregulate the biochemistry, in many cases, either weaken or create immune dysregulation. And then you're left vulnerable to other types of problems. One of the things we see with the autistic kids, it's not just unique to the autistic kids, it's just they're studied a lot, is that the existence of some of these mycotoxins causes immune suppression in the gut, which now creates a problem of proliferating candida and bacteria, which then just compound the problem. So I know this, I don't want to make it sound like it's hopeless for patients, right? Because it's not hopeless, but it is complicated. And in the conventional medical world, I can understand why many of them don't get into it, because they don't have the time. And, when you're compressed in time at a busy practice of 10-minute visits, you don't have 3-4 hours to delve into the research and try to figure out all the biochemistry.
Yeah, so what they need to do is keep crazy people like us around so that when they have some questions about it, we can go, oh, I've got an idea. I think I've run into this before.
Well, that's right. Well, I mean, I know you two exist and I exist, and I'm excited to be, I exist in the world of practitioners that are taking this on, and the conferences that are put together and the webinars that are put together and the podcasts that are put together are dedicated to this, because this topic alone requires a tremendous amount of study, a tremendous amount of understanding, and a tremendous amount of effort to be put forth to just try things to see what works. And the other thing that's absolutely critical in this is to have patients and people who are willing to try to do things to help as well. It's a two-way street, right? We've got to have people who are willing to try the types of remedies and things out there to see what kind of. So I've seen this in the autism world, I'm a huge believer that as a practitioner, I can't get very far if I don't have patients who are willing to explore and try different things along with me. Because that ultimately, we learn together in this approach very much.
Let me talk about the sick buildings for a minute, because if you watch one of these things in action, it's amazing, especially if you know where the Stachybotrys is, because the people who are closest to the colony got the sickest. There were people that were just another room away, or even on the other side of the same room, who escaped illness, whereas the people in direct proximity to the Stachybotrys were made permanently ill. So I saw this as kind of like a threshold event where people got up to a certain level, a certain dose, where it finally breached their immune defenses, probably broke down the tight junction proteins that protect us from these sort of things, gets into the blood, gets into the brain, breaks down the blood-brain barrier, and programs the microglia. And once you've got those memory T cells all programmed for a hyper response, then any low-level exposure to this kicks you into high gear again, which sort of explains to me why some people can be programmed for this so intensely, while other people not at all. I think there's some really interesting technology coming out where they can measure brain inflammation with an MRI. Various portions of the brain, they can detect the temperature. So with that kind of technology, we could take people, get them feeling as good as they're going to get, maybe out in the desert or some pristine location. And in the course of them going into a sick building again, when they start to exhibit symptoms, do one of these MRIs and just see how badly their brain is being inflamed by it.
Right. Yeah, it's an excellent point. I mean, I've seen that too, just re-exposure. It's almost instantaneous. So there's definitely memory cells that are sort of lying in wait, but I think it's probably even more just cellular reactivity is so primed that it doesn't take much of an insult to just trigger cellular reactions too.
How much of this do you think is a mast cell degranulation?
I think there's a component to that. I think it's more complicated than that. Clearly, you see that with people with allergic sensitivities, and I realize you don't always have to have an allergy to trigger some of the histamine aspects. I think for some cases it does get into problems in the methylation system. Things are happening at a genetic level where now you're creating dysregulation and methylation, and that can affect histamine regulation too. So I think I see it as a, what are those things called? Like the Venn diagram, the Venn diagram where you have, here's the circle and here's the unique things to that circle, but then there's an overlap with something else, an overlap with something else. I look at mast cell as sort of a component of this, but not necessarily something that just exists in isolation.
Well, lacking the ability to test these things many years ago, we were forced to rely on our observations, just watching people going in and out of sick buildings and see what happened to them. And sure enough, people in certain buildings became hypersensitive. Other people would come into contact with lots of mold, but they wouldn't become hypersensitive.
Right.
In fact, in the first peer-reviewed literature on black mold, Trichothecene Trichotoxins, Dr. William Croft in 1986, he talks about after remediation, everybody got better. And that was Stachybotrys. So what's the difference? Why is it in some cases people become hypersensitive and other times not?
Well, I think part of that comes down to differences in immune function. And I think also, in fact, I just did a conference this past weekend with Great Plains where I was talking about mitochondrial dysregulation and neurochemical imbalances, but there was another lecturer by the name of Bob Miller. And Bob is a specialist in looking at genomic profiles with a deep understanding of biochemical relationships. And one of the points that he made, which was very accurate, was that today more than ever, if I look back, I'm going to take the autism, the community as an example. So 15 years ago, we could use methyl B12 as a supplement therapy, do it through a subcutaneous injection. And by and large, for most kids, it would cause a profound improvement in eye contact and language development, environmental awareness. And many times the positive results stuck, right? And very rarely would you see negative reactions, which would be like hyperactivity or rare case aggression. Fast forward now, there's something different. Okay, and it's not like everybody, but there seems to be more kids that just either aren't responding to the methyl B12 like they used to, or are having more profound adverse reactions to it. Nothing extreme, but just more behavioral problems. It's like, well, what is the difference, now versus 10, 15 years ago now? And I think we could explain that there's likely just additional environmental factors, which are sort of being infused into our world, infused into our areas. And I think it has a compounding influence. So the mold, I know, has likely always been a problem, but maybe there's some other kind of environmental change that's happening. I don't know entirely, but I look at those kind of situations too, where I have somebody that is exposed to, you could see it in certain families, right? Why is a family of 4, 2 of the 4 people are totally fine being in the moldy environment and 2 are totally compromised? Okay, they're both pretty much eating the same food, same environment, same exposures. Well, there's something happening in the biochemistry at a cellular level, at a biochemical level, at an immune system level, where those 2 individuals are just having all kinds of issues and somebody else is able to handle the exposures. So that's sort of the unique aspect of what we do, is trying to understand sort of the unique qualities of, the underlying biochemistry and physiology and why some people are more susceptible to anything else. So I think eventually, right, if you keep throwing out toxins like these Trichothecenes from Stachybotrys, pretty much anybody's going to become sick eventually. It's just going to overwhelm their system. There isn't going to be anybody that's going to be able to hold off that onslaught forever.
Anybody and their dog or cat.
Right. And the pets, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
They're trying to blame human leukocyte antigens, and our pets don't even have human leukocyte antigens.
Yeah.
But it's a very curious thing. And one thing that I really like to point out a lot is that 25 years ago, it was like nobody knew about mold. you could suggest it to the top researchers in the world and they would not connect it with chronic fatigue syndrome. And now we spend a lot of time in the mold groups and doctors are dropping like flies. We pick up a new few mold cases of doctors who got sick and had to run for their lives themselves. So it's very alarming that this would go from so completely unknown to everywhere in only 25 years.
Yeah. I think it's in part, in part an antigen overload situation. We could speculate or theorize about some other aspects. I mean, I can look at just it's not just a problem happening here in the world. It's happening around here in the US. It's happening in other countries too. I think certainly the overuse of vaccinations, are certainly a compounding factor. Not that it's exposing people to mold, but perhaps it's just creating, immune system dysregulation at some level that might make people more susceptible from an inflammatory standpoint. I don't know. There's a lot that's known and there's a lot of unanswered questions. But one thing is clear is now that people's eyes are open to it, you can start to see it. And it's very difficult to be in denial about it anymore, although there are those that will continue to do so.
Yeah, I make routine trips to Stanford to tell them about this, and they are not having any part of it.
Yeah. Well, that doesn't surprise me. And I'm sure there's other things they're probably not having, any part of either with some of the things that we know are happening with people with chronic illness. So
What's really interesting, and we are exposing mold, and we do expose a lot. We know a lot of people, and I'm not going to say which vaccine maker. It's a COVID vaccine, but they're having contamination issues with their vials, and so I almost suspect that is happening across the board, even in food factories, because it just seems like there's so many, and this is speculative, of course.
sure.
So many of these, food places being burned down. There's plane crashes into these, food production facilities, and everyone's calling conspiracy, like, oh, they're trying to, I don't know, starve us, who knows. But I almost feel like if there's so much microbial issue, mold growth issue in buildings, maybe it's just a way for them to divert away from these issues that they're having in their factories. And it's much easier to collect from your insurer for a burnt down factory than it is for microbial issues, right?
Oh, that's an interesting take.
That's just kind of what I've been seeing and what I'm thinking, because if these major vaccine manufacturers can't even control contamination in their vials, what do you think is happening in the food world?
Right.
And so that's just sort of my thoughts.
Yeah, it may, that's actually an interesting thought, because for better or for worse, and through all the problems that our regulatory agencies have, nothing's perfect. I think they generally tend to do a pretty good job at trying to control mold and mycotoxins, because as a food exporter, no other country wants contaminated food coming in. We're not talking about chemicals, right? So maybe there's a problem happening at that level. Maybe the whole system is becoming so congested, corrupt, and dysfunctional that things are just falling apart all around us. Yeah.
We saw that in the beginning of COVID with the FDA stating that they're reducing their inspections for a lot of factories.
Right.
And so maybe that's just, this downstream issue that's happening where, things are falling through the cracks, and look what's happening, contamination.
Well, I think, but I think, it goes back to too, is that if you look at veterinary medicine, they've been more forward thinking than a lot of areas in human medicine. I mean, so the idea of mold and mycotoxins has been a big deal in agriculture for years, because they know it's a $1 billion crop industry, or $1 billion industry of livestock. So the last thing that you want is your livestock to get contaminated. In fact, there's companies out there that have chemists that are specifically designing, chemicals to sort of attack these mycotoxins and get rid of them. It just hasn't really crossed over into human medicine yet. I can imagine someday, the conventional medical world will take credit for having discovered the toxicity of mycotoxins, but I think it's just a slow moving machine that it's so bound up in bureaucracy and medical bureaucracy that they're just so far behind that
Are
it's
they
just
really though? Are they really are they far behind by choice? You know what I mean? Is
Yeah.
it because this has been going on for a while?
Well,
and-
I think it may be, I think there's certain elements that are by choice and some others may
Yeah.
be designed,
maybe to
because
divert.
I mean, anymore, if you look around, right, are we really, we're certainly not dealing with an honest system. We could get into the whole, things that we've all experienced in the past 3 years and realize, okay, there's a larger movement and agenda at foot, through the censorship and the squelching of known effective interventions. So that would certainly be a topic for another conversation at some point.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was actually a major portion of my goal in volunteering to help start this new chronic fatigue syndrome, was to cut out all the fuss and bother of researchers fighting each other, all the suppression and the cutthroat competition they get into, and just get some research onto the mold and get it done like right now.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, and to kind of, I actually have to wrap up here pretty quick because I've got a lecture at the bottom of the hour. But one of the things I think, and I know you as an individual, have experienced this, and this, unfortunately, even in today's world, most of us are on our own when it comes to our health. Because there is no government agency and regulatory agency that's going to save us from everything. And so people have to take it upon themselves to learn how to take care of themselves, learn how to be well, learn how to have things at home that they can do to deal with themselves, and also become more and more aware of the environmental pollutants that are around us. And that would certainly, mold and mycotoxins is a big one. And I talk to patients a lot when I hear them say, oh, it can't be that. And I'm like, well, why do you say that? The testing is showing exposure. Well, because I don't see any mold in my house. I'm like, that doesn't mean anything. It's not just, for me, it's not just at the medical level that there is maybe blindness and denial. There's a public awareness, or people might be aware of mold, but they're just not, they don't get it about how toxic these substances can be. And so the messaging isn't out there, so I think if anything, that what we can do in moving forward is just try to get more information out there about the danger of these things. If you see this, or you are experiencing this, this is something that absolutely should be looked into, because it could have devastating consequences for yourself and your family.
Absolutely.
Very well said. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you. And
welcome.
it's one thing to try to influence the doctors, but a lot of it is trying to influence the patients too, and their families, because a lot of them just don't want to believe it.
Right.
Just a short story before I know you have to go, but I have family members that they both have these mysterious cancers that hit all at once while they have a roof leak. And I'm trying to tell them this, and they don't want to listen to it. They want to say, oh, it's the hormones, that's why I got the cancer. Oh, and I'm not saying it's directly the mold, but there is a factor, and we do have to recognize that. So just like you said, continuing education and getting outreach to people as much as we can to let them know, hey, these are the dangers, and everyone is in danger of this. There isn't that 20% of the population that are the only ones that can become sick and susceptible to this. It's everyone. And so we really need to make that a known factor. So Dr. Woeller, we had such a great time with you today. Great conversation. You're awesome.
And where can we get in touch with you?
Yes.
So
Where can
a
people
couple
find you?
places. If people are interested in consulting with me directly, mysunrisecenter.com. So that's mysunrisecenter.com is the website for my main practice. If there is practitioners that are listening who are interested in courses that we have something called Integrative Medicine Academy, where we have mastery courses in hormones and toxicity and mold and organic acid testing. And then finally, for other people who are maybe just interested in accessing certain lab tests, there's actually a website called labtestsplus.com. And that website actually offers certain lab tests, urine tests, hair, saliva, and you can actually test mycotoxins. So for Great Plains Laboratory, actually, one of the tests that's offered through that website is their mycotox profile, just to be able to say, do I have existence of mycotoxins? And all of those labs actually come with a written interpretation on the relevant findings of those labs. So for just general information about lab testing regarding this, go to labtestplus.com.
Great. A little birdie on the street told me that you have a podcast coming up too. Is that true?
I do. That is in the works. In fact, that's one of the things I'm trying to get started here. I've been extremely busy, not enough time in the day, but that's one of the things I'm looking to start here in the next few weeks. And
Fantastic.
yeah, I've got a lot of things to share, and just like you two, just being able to get more information out there, not only to just doctors and scientists, but to the general public, because we're all in this together, right? This is
Absolutely.
all how we learn and just share information and just try to get it out there. It's fantastic. It's absolutely necessary.
Absolutely. If you plan on doing a CFS bit, please consider Eric as a host.
I absolutely will. I most definitely will.
He knows the history and he's been advocating for 30 years now on, trying to get researchers to say, hey, mold's doing something weird and it's
Yeah.
making people sick. And this is what happened in Lake Tahoe with my group. So thanks again. We appreciate your time. And listeners, please check out Dr. Woeller. He is a wealth of knowledge. Man, this guy has so much information on his site, on autism to autoimmune issues to everything you can think of. So please check that out. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you guys next time.